B'siyata d'shmaya, we're going to learn Beitza Daf Yomi. We're going to start 2 lines from the top of the Omid. Says the Gemara, Tonu Rabbanon, Yom Tov Shechol Liyos B'Shabbos. It doesn't say Shabbos Shechol Liyos, but Yom Tov, because the main focus on a Yom Tov is always the Yom Tov. The Shabbos is just added on. Yom Tov Shechol Liyos B'Shabbos. There's a Machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel as to how the Shemona Esrei was said. Beis Shammai Oimrim Mispadel Shmoina, that in the regular tefillas one says 8 brachis. V'oimer shel Shabbos bifnei atzmo v'shel Yom Tov bifnei atzmo. Then there's the first 3 brachos are the regular 3 brachos of Shemona Esrei. The last 3 brachos are the regular 3 brachos at the end of every Shemona Esrei. In the middle there's 2 brachos. There's one bracha for Shabbos and there's another bracha for Yom Tov. Beis Hillel argue with Beis Shammai and say Mispalil Sheva. That's what we do. There's only one bracha in the middle, which is the Yom Tov bracha, and what he does is Maschil B'Shel Shabbos. The bracha starts mentioning Shabbos. V'sitein lonu, I'm quoting Rashi, V'sitein lonu es yom hamenucha hazeh. And then Umesayim B'Shel Shabbos, and finishes with Shabbos, Baruch Ato Hashem Mekadesh HaShabbos, and we don't mention Yom Tov in the bracha at the end. V'oimer Kedushas Hayom Be'emtza, and in the middle, after one says V'sitein lonu es yom hamenucha hazeh, one says V'es yom Chag Ploini, Chag whatever it is, Chag Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkos, whatever the Yom Tov is, in the middle of the bracha. But at the end of the bracha, one does not mention the Yom Tov, one only mentions the Shabbos. Rabbi Omer, Rabbi, a third opinion, argues and says, Af chaysim ba, that not only do you mention Yom Tov in the middle of the bracha, this middle bracha, the 7th bracha, so to speak, but the middle bracha, not only do you mention Yom Tov in the middle bracha, but also at the end of the bracha, you mention the Yom Tov, and you say Mekadesh HaShabbos, Yisrael V'azmanim. And you mention not only Mekadesh HaShabbos, and you also mention Yisrael v'Hazmanim. And we'll note that Shabbos is mentioned before the Yisrael and the Zmanim. Toni Kamed Ravina. The person that was reading the Brises before Ravina, he read this to Ravina. But he didn't say Mekadesh HaShabbos Yisrael v'Hazmanim. This Chochem that was reading the Brisa to Ravina, he actually said Mekadesh Yisrael v'Shabbos v'Hazmanim. He mentioned Yisrael before Shabbos. Omar Leisa, Ravina said to this Chochem, Otu Shabbos Yisrael Mekachele. It seems that the sequence is a sequence which is not by chance. It's telling us how things came about, as if Klal Yisrael are responsible for being Mekadesh Shabbos and for being Mekadesh the Zmanim. We know that Klal Yisrael are responsible for the Kedusha, for the sanctity of the Yomim Tovim, because Yomim Tovim are dependent on the month, unlike Shabbos, which is dependent on the week. A month, unlike the week, which just 7 days goes round, the month has a beginning, starts with a Rosh Chodesh. Rosh Chodesh only starts when the Chachmei Yisrael determine it's Rosh Chodesh. They say Mekudesh, Mekudesh. So now Ravina was asking, Otu Shabbos Yisrael Mekacheluhu? Are Klal Yisrael responsible for the Kedushas Shabbos, that it makes sense to say Mekadesh Yisrael v'Shabbos v'Hazmanim v'Shabbos Mekache v'Kaimo? Shabbos is Kodesh on its own right. Every 7th day from the beginning of creation, the 7th day is Shabbos, and Shabbos is Kodesh on its own right. Eloheinu, what you should say is Mekadesh HaShabbos. First, you should say Mekadesh HaShabbos, and then mention Yisrael v'Hazmanim, as we saw that Rabbi said in the Brisa before, Mekadesh HaShabbos Yisrael v'Hazmanim, and that is the minig that we follow in our Machzorim. You'll notice that is how we end the bracha on Yom Tov Shechol Liyos B'Shabbos. Omer Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef says halacha kaRebbi. Number 1 halacha is like Rabbi, that you mention Yom Tov at the end of the bracha, not like Beis Hillel that says that you don't mention Yom Tov in the bracha. Ukadatoritz Ravina, and the way that Ravina explained that we mention first Shabbos and then Yisrael and then V'Hazmanim. Continues the Gemara. Tonu Rabbanon Shabbos Shechol Liyos B'Rosh Chodesh. Here we mention Shabbos first because we're talking about Shabbos, which is also Rosh Chodesh. So the main tefillah is a Shabbos Diga tefillah. We also mention Rosh Chodesh with it. Shabbos shechol liyos b'Rosh Chodesh, oy b'choiloi shel moed, or a Shabbos Chol HaMoed, and on a regular Chol HaMoed, we daven a regular Shemona Esrei. We don't add on extra brachas for Chol HaMoed. We're talking here about the regular tefillahs, of which we're about to say Arvis, V'Shachris, or Mincha, the regular Ma'ariv, Shachris, and Mincha. Where on Chol HaMoed, we don't add on a bracha, and on Rosh Chodesh also not. So the question is, how do we do this? It's talking about Shabbos. Shabbos, how many brachas are there in a regular Shabbos tefillah? There's 7 brachas. Mispalel Sheva. Like every single Shabbos, that there's 7 brachas. There's 3 brachas at the beginning of Shemona Esrei, 3 brachas in the middle, 3 brachas at the end, and 1 in the middle, which ends with Mekadesh HaShabbos. However, because it's also Rosh Chodesh or also Chol HaMoed, you add in something to make mention of the fact that it's not just a regular Shabbos, it's a Shabbos with Rosh Chodesh or Chol HaMoed. V'omer me'en ha'ma'ira, you mention the ma'ira, the happening, you mention the uniqueness of this day, which is that it's also Rosh Chodesh or Chol HaMoed ba'avodah, which means that you say Ya'alev Yavoy in Avodah, that's in the bracha of Rotzei before Sechzeno, we say the bracha of Ya'alev Yavoy. And in Ya'alev Yavoy we either mention Rosh Chodesh or we mention the Chol HaMoed, we mention the Moed. V'imloi Omar, if you didn't say Ya'alev Yavoy, Machzir Noisei, then he has to go back. Rabbi Eliezer says you don't say Ya'alev Yavoy in Avodah as we do, rather Boheidah, in the same place that we say Al Hanisim on Chanukah and Purim, over there in the Moedim bracha, that's where you mention the Rosh Chodesh and the Chol HaMoed. So that's all regarding the Ma'ariv, Shachris, and Mincha. Uba Musafin. However, when it comes to Musaf, Maschil B'Shel Shabbos, you start off mentioning the regular Shabbos Musaf. Umasayim B'Shel Shabbos, and you mention at the end of the bracha, you just say Mekadesh HaShabbos. V'oimer Kedushas Hayom Be'emtza, and in the middle, you also mention the Kedushas Hayom. You mentioned either the Rosh Chodesh or the Chol HaMoed. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, Rabbi Shmuel ben Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroika, they were a pair of Chachamim, and they said, Kol Mokim Shehuz Kak L'Sheva, whenever you need 7 brachas, even on a regular Shabbos, Maschil B'Shel Shabbos, you start off with Shabbos, Umasayim B'Shel Shabbos, and you finish off with Mekadesh HaShabbos, V'oimer Kedushas Hayom Be'emtza, and you say the Kedushas Hayom in the middle. Which means that even a Shachris, Mincha, and Ma'ariv of a regular Shabbos, when you have Rosh Chodesh or Chol HaMoed, then you mention Kedushas Hayom in the middle, and you don't mention the Ya'alev Yavoy in the Avodah. Omer Rav Huna said, Ein halacha k'oisei hazug. The halacha is not like that pair. Rather, the halacha is like the Tanakama. The Tanakama say that by Shachris, Mincha, and Ma'ariv of Shabbos, then you mention the Me'en HaMa'ira, you mention that in the Avodah, but the halacha is not like the Tanakama regarding Musaf, because the Tanakama say regarding Musaf that you only mention the Kedushas Hayom, the Yom Tov, the Rosh Chodesh, in the middle of the bracha. You don't mention it at the end of the bracha. That means, but for that, we do not hold of the Tanakama of this brisa. Rather, we hold of what Rabbi said before, that you, at the end of that 7th, the middle bracha, you say Mekadesh HaShabbos v'Yisrael v'Hazmanim, or Mekadesh HaShabbos v'Yisrael v'Roshei Chodoshim, in the event that it's Rosh Chodesh. Continues the Gemara, Omer of Chia bar Ashi Omar Rav. Maniach Odom Eruvei Tchumin Miyom Tov Lechaveiroi Umasne. We know that if a person wants to carry on Shabbos or Yom Tov outside the Tchum means the area 2,000 Amos beyond the place of his residence at the onset of Shabbos and Yom Tov. And this is an Eruv that has to be made before Shabbos and Yom Tov starts. And over here, we've got a Yom Tov which is 2 days in Chutz La'aretz. It's Thursday, Friday is Yom Tov. He didn't make his Eruv before Yom Tov. It's now Thursday, and he wants to know, can he make an Eruv even though it's Yom Tov? The answer is yes and no. Why? Because a 2-day Yom Tov, if we break it down, it's really 2 days that we have to practice Yom Tov because we don't know which one is the real Yom Tov, and this is something we've discussed earlier on in the Masechta. So you've got a 2-day Yom Tov where it's either Thursday or Friday, even though we practice both of them Yom Tov, but only one of them is really Yom Tov. So he puts this Eruv down on Thursday, which is the first day Yom Tov. Now, if Thursday is the real Yom Tov, you cannot make an Eruv. But if Thursday is the real Yom Tov, then Friday is not Yom Tov. He can make the Eruv on Friday to be valid for Shabbos. If Thursday is not a Yom Tov, you can put down the Eruv on Thursday and it will be valid for Friday for the Yom Tov. So that's what it means. Umasna, you can make a condition. He puts the Eruv down and he says as follows: if today is Yom Tov, then the Eruv I'm putting down now is not valid, and tomorrow when I put the Eruv down again, because tomorrow will not be Yom Tov, the Eruv will be valid. And if today is not Yom Tov, then I want this to be a valid Eruv. That's the condition that he can make, and it's valid. So says Rav. Omar Rava. Rava moves to a different type of Eruv, not an Eruv Tchumen, but an Eruv Tavshilin. As we've been discussing, a person is not normally allowed to cook on Yom Tov for after Yom Tov. However, if Yom Tov is on Erev Shabbos on Friday, or Thursday, Friday, and you want to cook on Yom Tov for Shabbos, then if you make an Eruv Tavshilin, which means you start cooking for Shabbos before Yom Tov, you can continue cooking on Yom Tov for Shabbos. But what happens if you forgot to make the Eruv Tavshilin on Wednesday, which is Erev Yom Tov, and it's now Yom Tov Thursday, Friday? What can he do? So Omar Rava says, Maniach Odom Eruvei Tavshilin miyom Tov lechaveroi umasne. He can put the Eruv Tavshilin down, make the Eruv Tavshilin on Thursday, and say as follows: if today is the real Yom Tov, Thursday, this Eruv Tavshilin is, number one, invalid because you cannot make an Eruv Tavshilin on Yom Tov, and number two, not necessary, because if today is the real Yom Tov, then tomorrow, Friday, is not the real Yom Tov, and I can then cook on Friday for Shabbos without a problem. If today, Thursday, is not the real Yom Tov, I want this to be the Eruv Tavshilin to allow me to cook on Friday for Shabbos. And that's the masna, that's the condition he puts down when he makes his Eruv Tavshilin on the Thursday. Says the Gemara, Man da'oma Eruvei Tchumen, Rav, who says that you can make this condition regarding Eruvei Tchumen, Kolshken Eruvei Tavshilin, then of course he'll agree that even Eruv Tavshilin you can make with such a condition, which is what Rava said. However, Man da'omar Eruvei Tavshilin, Rava, who said that you can make this condition regarding Eruv Tavshilin, Aval Eruvei Tchumen loy. However, he may well hold that Eruvei Tchumen is more stringent, and therefore you're not allowed to make an Eruv Tchumen on Yom Tov in such a fashion, even though it's true that the 2 days of Yom Tov are, each day is just a suffix, but Lemaisa, the Chachamim said both days have to be treated as Yom Tov, and making an Eruv Tchumen on Yom Tov is more stringent than making an Eruv Tavshilin. And because the Issa of Tchumen is more stringent than the Issa of cooking on Yom Tov for Shabbos, the Issa of cooking on Yom Tov to Shabbos is only an Issa d'Rabbanon. However, Tchumen is more serious than that, and therefore he may well hold that Eruvei Tavshilin you can do with such a type of combination, but Eruv Tchumen not. My tama why? Because in order to acquire a place of residence, which is what Eruv Tavshilin, which is what Eruv Tchumen does, b'Shabbato, referring here to Yom Tov, that to make an Eruv Tchumen on Yom Tov is something which they did not allow, because making an Eruv Tchumen, acquiring residence, is something which is much more severe and something which we don't want them to do on Yom Tov, and therefore we'd, even for the covered Shabbos, even in order to be allowed a person for the sake of Shabbos to go outside the Tchum on Shabbos, we don't let him. However, to make an Eruv Tavshilin is much more, is an easier thing to do. It's not so challenging on Yom Tov to cook for Shabbos, and therefore, for the sake of Shabbos, for covered Shabbos, they're allowed to make an Eruv Tavshilin. Continues the Gemara, Tonu Rabbanon. Ein oifin miyom tov lechaveroi. You're not allowed to bake bread from one day Yom Tov to the other day Yom Tov. However, be'emes amru, they said that memale isha kol hakdeira basar, a woman is allowed to fill up a whole pot of meat, even though she only really needs one piece of meat for Yom Tov. You can fill up the whole pot on the first day of Yom Tov, or on Yom Tov, even though you know there's going to be some, or most of it is going to be left over for after Yom Tov. Rashi says, since it's a single effort, chad tircha, therefore it's okay. Since you're not adding any more effort, you're not doing more work and effort for after Yom Tov, it's allowed. And similarly, a baker is allowed to fill up a barrel with water, even though he only needs a single jug of it, because filling up the barrel is the same effort to fill it up with a little bit or to fill it up a lot, then you're allowed to. But when it comes to baking the loaves, you're only allowed to put into the oven the breads you actually intend using or need for Yom Tov, because every extra loaf is an extra effort to bake it, to knead it, to prepare it, to bake it, to then remove it from the oven. All that extra effort is not allowed if you don't need it for Yom Tov. Reb Shimon ben Elazar argues and says, a woman is allowed to fill the entire oven with bread, even though she only maybe needs a single loaf. Because typically the ovens were small, and the more breads that were stuck to the walls of the oven, which is the way they would bake, the less airspace there would be in the oven. The less airspace, the more concentrated the heat will be. The more concentrated the heat will be, the better the breads will be baked. And therefore, in order to bake the one loaf that you need in a very good way, you're allowed to fill up the rest of the oven with loaves. Rava said, halacha Reb Shimon ben Elazar, that's the halacha like Reb Shimon ben Elazar says, that a woman is allowed to fill up the entire oven with bread, even though she doesn't need it all on Yom Tov. Asks the Gemara, following question, somebody who did not put down an Erev Tavshilin, is Erev Yom Tov. Yom Tov is either Friday or Thursday Friday in Chutz La'aretz, and this person wants to now prepare on Yom Tov for after Yom Tov, for Shabbos, but he didn't make an Erev Tavshilin. What's the story? Hu ne'asar v'kimchoi ne'asar, oy dilma, hu ne'asar v'en kimchoi ne'asar. A person who didn't make an Erev Tavshilin is definitely not allowed to cook or bake based on an Erev Tavshilin he didn't make. However, if this Reuven, who didn't make an Erev Tavshilin, but he's got flour in his home, is somebody else allowed to take Reuven's flour that somebody else did make an Erev Tavshilin? Are you allowed to take Reuven's flour and bake it? Or do we say no? Reuven didn't make an Erev Tavshilin, you're not even allowed to cook his flour. And if you want to cook his bread for him, you actually have to do an act of acquiring the flour. He has to give it to you as a gift, make a kinyan, acquire it. Once it's legally yours, you can do what you want with it. But all the while it belongs to him, maybe you're not allowed to cook it or bake it because he didn't make an Erev Tavshilin. That's the question. Hu ne'asar v'kimchoi ne'asar? Do we say that not only he is not allowed to cook or bake based on an Erev Tavshilin he didn't make, but also his flour? Or Dilma, maybe not. Hu ne'asar, only he cannot bake. V'en kimchoi ne'asar, but his kemach, his flour, did not become osar. L'may nafka. What halachic ramification will there be? La'aknuye kimchoi la'achirim. Whether you have to transfer ownership of the flour to somebody else if somebody else wants to make the bread for Reuven. If you say that the flour also became osar, if you want somebody to make him bread with his flour, he's going to have to transfer the ownership of it to his friend, to somebody else. However, if you say that he's not allowed to bake, but somebody else is allowed to bake for him, then he would not have to then transfer the ownership to somebody else. Somebody else can just use Reuven's flour and make the bread. What's the halacha? That's the question of the Gemara. Tashema, we're going to try and bring proof. The Brisa says as follows: if somebody did not make an Erev Tavshilin, hareze lo yefa, he's not allowed to bake V'lo yavashel, he's not allowed to cook. V'lo yatmin, he's not allowed to insulate. They used to insulate certain foods by totally submerging it into other foods or by totally insulating a pot. We learnt about hatmona in Masechet Shabbos. Then it's what you're not allowed to do hatmona on Shabbos. And so somebody who didn't do an Erev Tavshilin is not allowed to do hatmona either. Loi, not him himself, v'loi la'achirim, and not for some, nor can he do it for somebody else if he didn't make an Erev Tavshilin, v'loi achirin, and this is the important point, that neither can other people be oifin umavashlin loi. They cannot bake or cook for him. What should he do if he needs somebody who has made an Erev Tavshilin to cook for him? He should transfer the ownership of his flour to those other people, and then they can bake it for him. They can bake for him, or they can cook for him. So what do we see in this brisa? Shma mina. We see from here, hu nesar v'kimchoi nesar. It's clear that not only is he not allowed to cook or bake, neither is his flour allowed to be cooked or baked. All the while it's under his ownership. He has to transfer the ownership to somebody else who has done an Erev Tavshilin, and then they can cook or bake for him. Shma mino, indeed that is a solid proof. So asks the Gemara, Boelu, another question the Gemara asks, Ovar v'ofa. If this person, he transgressed what the Chachomim said. The Chachomim said, if you want to cook or bake on Yom Tov for Shabbos, you must make an Erev Tavshilin. This person, he ignored that, and he did bake on Yom Tov for Shabbos. What's the halacha? Is he allowed to eat it on Shabbos or not? Tashma, we're going to try and bring proof from a brisa. Somebody who didn't make an Erev Tavshilin, what should he do? He needs to eat something on Shabbos. He should transfer the ownership of his flour to other people. And other people can bake for him. And they can cook for him. That's what it says in the brisa. The Gemara is saying, if it's true that if he did bake, that he's allowed to eat it, even though he did it against what the Chachomim said, he didn't make an Erev Tavshilin. Listener, why didn't the brisa say, Ovar v'ofa, if he transgressed what the Chachomim said and he did bake, mutar, that he's allowed to eat it? Why is this detail omitted from the brisa? So Omar of Adabar Masna, Rabbi Adabar Masna says there's no proof from that brisa. It could well be that the brisa is telling you what you should do, not what the halacha is if you do what you shouldn't do. The brisa says, Keitzad, what should he do in a permitted way? What he should do is he should transfer the ownership to somebody else and let that somebody else bake for him. Tana tekanta de hateira ktani. The brisa is telling us what to do in a permitted fashion. Tekanta de isura, about what happens if you got out of your dilemma in a prohibited way. Leikatani, that's not what the brisa was coming to teach us. So you do not have proof from that brisa. Tashma, we're trying to bring proof from a different brisa. Mi shehiniach erev tavshilin. Somebody who made an erev tavshilin, hareze oifa, he can bake, umavashal, he can cook, umatmin, and he could insulate the food, hatmona. V'im rotza lechol es eruvay. Once he's finished cooking or baking and doing what he needs to do, he then wants to eat the eruv food, the part of the food that he initially used for his eruv tavshilin. Haroshus biyodo, he has permission to do that. Ochloi, if however he ate the eruv ad sheloi ofa, before he baked, ad sheloi hitmin, or before he did hatmona, and the Bach says you have to add in here also ad sheloi bishel, or before he cooked. Hareze lo yofa. He's not allowed to bake. V'lo yavashel, he's not allowed to cook. V'lo yatmin, he's not allowed to insulate the food. Loi, not for himself. V'lo l'achirim, not for others. V'lo achirin oifinu mavashlin loi. Nor can others bake, cook, or insulate his food for him. Aval mavashel hu leYom Tov. What he can do is, he can cook for Yom Tov, because it's Yom Tov. In Yom Tov you can cook for Yom Tov. V'im hoisir, if there's any leftovers, hoisir l'Shabbos. He's allowed to leave it over, and he's allowed to eat the leftovers on Shabbos. And we're obviously talking about here doing extra efforts. He's not doing any extra efforts. We saw before that if cooking more does not involve any extra efforts, we said that this person can cook a whole pot of meat, even though he only needs one piece. We're talking here about when preparing for Shabbos would involve extra effort. You're not allowed to do that because he hasn't got an Erev Tavshilin, but if he has leftovers from Yom Tov, he can eat them on Shabbos. Uvilvad shelo yarim, on condition that he doesn't do this type of a scheme. He doesn't like say to himself that, I have one pot, and then he says, I've cooked this pot for Yom Tov, and then he says, no, I've actually changed my mind, I want a different pot for Yom Tov. So he's like playing a game, so to speak, in order he should have more leftovers, in order to have food for Shabbos, that he's not allowed to do. The question is, and the Brisa says, V'im herim, but if he did make this scheme, he did bluff it and say, I've changed my mind, what I cooked before, I don't want for Yom Tov, I want to cook something else for Yom Tov. If he played this scheme, osur. He's not allowed to eat it on Shabbos. So you see clearly from here that if you cooked on Yom Tov and then it's for Shabbos, and you don't have an Erev Tavshilin, you're not allowed to eat it. Osur, you're not allowed to eat it. So it would seem to be proof from here for our question we said before. We asked, are you allowed to eat it if ovar v'ofar? The answer is no. Omer Rashi says no. You don't have proof from here. Ha'aroma ka'omrus, you're trying to prove from a case where he did ha'aroma, he was deceiving. He didn't blatantly say, I'm going against what the Chachamim say, and I'm cooking or baking, even though I don't have an Erev Tavshilin. No, he's saying, oh no, I'm changing my mind. He's playing a game. Playing a game is called ha'aroma. Shani ha'aroma de'ichmiru barabonon tfeimi mezid. The Chachamim were more stringent with people who are distorting Torah than people who are going against the Torah b'mezid intentionally. And Rashi explains, because if you did it intentionally, he's a Rasha. If he's a Rasha, number one, no one's going to learn from him. Number two, at some point he's going to pay attention to the fact that he's going against the Torah, against the Chachamim. He'll do tshuva and he'll mend his ways. And therefore, it could be the Chachamim were not so stringent on him. But somebody who's playing games and is distorting Torah and trying to say, oh no, what I cooked before, I don't want that for Yom Tov, I want something else for Yom Tov, and he's playing games. If he's playing games, number one, others are going to learn from him, thinking it's okay. Number two, he himself is going to think it's okay, and therefore he's not going to do tshuva, and therefore it could be in that case, imherim, osur, indeed it's osur. So you don't have proof from this brisa. Rashi actually says that the ha'aroma that he's doing is he's saying, oh, I need some more, maybe guests will come, oh, it's still not enough, maybe more guests will come. He's doing some type of ha'aroma, something, he's making a claim which is not straight. Says the Gemara, another way of disproving from this brisa, either like Rav Ashi says, you cannot prove ha'aroma to mezid. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchok Omar, ha'mani chananyahi. It could well be that this brisa that says imherim osor, it could be that ha'aroma and mezid is the same. And indeed you have proof from here that if you cooked without an erev tavshilin, it's osor. But it still won't help us, because we know that Beis Shammai, they had a more stringent opinion regarding Eruvei Tchumin, Eruvei Tavshilin. So it could well be the author of this brisa is Beis Shammai, and we're asking according to Beis Hillel. What would Beis Hillel hold about somebody who was ovar v'ofar? Hamani Chananyahi v'alibah de Beis Shammai. Maybe this is Chananya, and Chananya's opinion of Beis Shammai. The Tanya, we learned in a brisa. We're going to see this later on. Chananya oimer. Beis Shammai oimrim. Beis Shammai hold according to Chananya. Beis Shammai say ein oifin Elim ken irev bepas. According to Beis Shammai, you can only bake on Yom Tov for Shabbos if the erev tavshilin you made was with something baked, with bread. Ve'in mevashlim, and you can only cook on Yom Tov for Shabbos, Elim ken irev betavshil, only if you made an erev tavshilin with a cooked item. Ve'in toimnin, you can only insulate the food on Yom Tov for Shabbos, Elim ken hoyu chamin tmunin me'erev Yom Tov, only if you did have tamona as your erev tavshilin. Beis Hillel, however, are more lenient and say no. Ma'ariv, you can make an eruv b'tavshil echod with a single cooked food, v'oisa by kol tzorka, and you can do with it whatever you want. On Yom Tov for Shabbos, you can even bake with it and do atmona with it. It's okay. So you see here, according to Chananya, Beis Shammai are more stringent by eruv tavshilin. So maybe the brisa that says imherim osir is Beis Shammai, and the question was, what would Beis Hillel hold? Says the Gemara Toshima. The Gemara is going to try and bring proof from a Mishnah. None we learnt in a Mishnah. Hama'asir peirosav b'Shabbos. We know that you're not allowed to take trumas and maisrus on Shabbos. What happens if somebody took trumas and maisrus on Shabbos and it's nesa d'Rabbanon? B'shoigig, if he did it by mistake, yoichel, he's allowed to eat it. B'meizid, if he did it intentionally, lo yoichel, he's not allowed to. So what do we see from here? That even at the expense of Oineg Shabbos, we're not going to let him eat from the food that he took Trumas and Maestros from on Shabbos. So we'll assume the same applies to Eruv Tavshilin. Cooking without Eruv Tavshilin is an Osur D'Rabbanon. If he did it b'mezid, lo yeichal, he's not allowed to eat. Says the Gemara, no, lo tzricha islei peira achrina. It could be that Mishnah is talking about where he's got other food for Shabbos, and therefore it's not necessary to allow him to eat these fruits on Shabbos, since he took Trumas and Maestros in a way that was osur. However, Eruv Tavshilin, if he cannot cook, or now that he's cooked, he doesn't have anything else to eat on Shabbos, and it's true that he shouldn't have cooked because he didn't make an Eruv Tavshilin, but if you don't let him eat this, he's going to be lacking in his Oineg Shabbos, maybe it'll be mutter. So you don't have proof from that brisa, from that Mishnah. Tashma, we're going to try and bring proof from another Mishnah. Hamat bil kelov, if somebody, let's assume somebody's got a kelim mikveh, a mikveh that's kosher to tovel kelim in his chotzer, and he tovels his kelim, which is an Issa D'Rabbanon to do that, b'Shabbos he does it on Shabbos. B'Sheigig, if he did it by mistake, Yishtamish Behem, he's allowed to use these kelim on Shabbos. B'Mezid, if he did it intentionally, he knew that he wasn't allowed to do it, he did it nonetheless, even though it's only also midrabanon. Lo yishtamish ben, he's not allowed to use them. So what the Gemara is saying, let's assume that cooking without Eruv Tavshilin is similar to toveling kelim on Shabbos. Says the Gemara, no. Lo tzricha de'islei mona achrina. It could be over there we're talking about that he's got other utensils and vessels to use on Shabbos, and not allowing him to use these ones is not going to be at the expense of his Oineg Shabbos. If you don't let this person eat the food he made on Yom Tov for Shabbos, he's not going to have food for Shabbos. Inamyo, it could be efshar b'sha'ela. He can borrow utensils. We don't have to allow him to use these kelim that were toveled Be'isr D'Rabbanon on Shabbos. We don't need to allow him to do that in order for him to have his Shabbos needs. But maybe Eruv Tavshilin, we have to be more lenient because he's got nothing to eat on Shabbos. Tashma, we're going to bring another proof from yet another Mishnah. Mavashel b'Shabbos, if somebody cooked on Shabbos, b'Shoigeg, if he did it by mistake, yoichel, he can eat it on Shabbos. B'Mezid, if he did it intentionally, lo yoichel, he's not allowed to eat it. So the Gemara is assuming that using food that was baked or cooked on Yom Tov for Shabbos without Eruv Tavshilin should be the same as somebody who cooks on Shabbos, and if you did it b'Mezid, lo yoichel. Says the Gemara, no. Isura de Shabbos shani. Cooking on Shabbos is an Issa d'Oraisa, and therefore it's much more serious. You cooked on Shabbos b'Mezid, you're not allowed to eat it. However, cooking without an Eruv Tavshilin from Yom Tov to Shabbos is only an Issa d'Rabbanon, and therefore it could well be we would be more lenient. Continues the Gemara. Bis Shammai oimrim shnei tavshilin. And this takes us back to the Mishnah on Daf Tezvav Amud Beis. There's a machlokes in the Mishnah. How many cooked foods do you need for Eruv Tavshilin? Bis Shammai say shnei tavshilin, you need 2. Bis Hillel oimrim tavshil echad. Bis Hillel say 1 is enough. Says the Gemara, Masnisin deloi kai Tana. Our Mishnah is not like the following Tana of the Brisa. The Tanya Omer Reb Shimon ben Elazar. Moedim Beishamai Beshilel. According to this brisa, there's no argument between Beishamai and Beshilel al Shnei Tavshilin Shetzorich, that you need to have 2 cooked foods, 2 cooked items for Eruv Tavshilin. Al Ma Nechluku, what they're arguing about, they're arguing a certain case where it's questionable whether something is considered 1 or 2. Al Dog Ubeitza She'olov, if you have a fish and on it, attached to the fish, you've got an egg that's on it, and his bottle, it's attached and is almost just an annex to the fish. Beishamai say it's considered as 2 fish and egg. Beshilel say since they're together, bound together as one, and one is toffel to the other, it's considered just a single tavshil. Veshovin and Beshilel and Beishamai both agree shempir per beitza, that if you mashed a boiled egg, v'nosan a toicha dog, and you put it inside the fish, and there it's not like annexed to the fish, it's not attached to the fish, it's just one thing inside the other fish, one thing inside the other, but it's clearly 2 food items. Or in the case, sherisei kaflutois, if he minced kaflutois, v'nosan a dog, and he put it inside the fish, shehen shnei tavshilin, that they both agree it's considered 2 tavshilin, and it suffices. So in our Mishnah, where Beis Hillel say 1 cooked item is enough, it's not like this brisa that says that even according to Beis Hillel, you need 2. Omar Rava said, Hilchas katana didon, the halacha is like the Tana of our Mishnah, V'aliba de B'Hillel, like B'Hillel, that a single cooked item is enough. Continues the Gemara, we saw that again, the end of the Mishnah, the final statement in the Mishnah, that if the Eruv Tafshilin got eaten or lost before he cooked on Yom Tov for Shabbos, lo yivashel olav b'tchila, he should not cook on them based on the Eruv Tafshilin, he shouldn't cook on Yom Tov for Shabbos. V'mshir mimenu kol shu, however, if there's a little bit left over, soymech alav l'Shabbos, he can rely on what's left over for Shabbos. Says the Gemara, Omar Abaya, Noktinon hischil be'isosoi v'nechal iruvoi goimer. Abaya says that if you already started making the dough whilst the Eruv Tafshilin was still existing, then you're allowed to, and then the Eruv Tafshilin got eaten up, goimer is allowed to continue making the dough and baking it, even though when he actually finishes the process, the Eruv Tafshilin no longer exists. That doesn't matter. Since when he started, there was an Eruv Tafshilin, he's allowed to continue. And in Mirz Hashem, in the next shiur, we're going to continue the next Mishnah.